It's 6 after. Looking through last week's, I didn't actually put up notes, but I did upload the video to the new channel. So there is a YouTube channel that has all of these. And I created I forget what it's called, some sort of category that has the tools and CI meetings, and they'll all be listed under there. And so I will make sure each week that at minimum gets done, and I will try to put some basic notes in the discussion. The discussion hasn't led to a lot of conversation, so I'm not going to spend a bunch of time there. Did anyone go to the YouTube channel and see anything?
I did. Does that count?
Well, I'm glad to hear that. Are you okay with how I created the track or whatever it's called? I don't even remember what it's called.
Yeah, playlist. Yes,
Playlist.
That's absolutely perfect.
Okay.
I've done the
Great.
same thing for the community meetings, so people can just click on the community meetings and see the entire playlist for those.
Perfect.
So yes, what you did was absolutely perfect.
Okay. As far as kind of any ongoing topics, I'm not aware of any updates from my side. Sorry, I'm briefly looking through. I know that my main work item from last week was to meet with Lemming and talk about the release notes and get a bunch more content added there. I did not do that, so that'll be on my list for this week. Otherwise, I think that is most of the recap. Michael, or anyone else want to bring up any items, or is there anything on the GitHub PR process or anything else you want to bring up?
Yes, I can cover some status on the PR process. And Nikki, I apologize if you feel like you've gotten blasted with notifications from a repo. You're my guinea pig.
I was just going to tell you that yes, being spam, you now go directly to my trash can. So
there you go. Perfect.
If you need me to look at something, please send me an email.
Yes, of course. Yes, you're definitely in the. That's the appropriate use of that those emails right now. I can share for just a minute here. So the piece I've been working on is this idea that we would use the code owners file for maintainers and a new reviewers file in the code owners format for the reviewers that we currently have in maintainers.txt. And last week I said that I had come up with a way to translate maintainers to code owners and reviewers that was verified for every file in our repo got the same answer. So I at least showed that it was possible to convert to that syntax. So the support for code owners is effectively built into GitHub when you activate it. So we don't have to do any special processing for that. This extra file called reviewers is something that we have to handle and what I'm suggesting is a GitHub action to do that, to assign additional reviewers to a PR if they're noted as being required for the files that are being modified. Now, when I think about the overall algorithm for the action, there's a couple events that we want to look for, and they are the open PR, a forced push to a PR, and a draft PR to a normal PR. So when those occur, that's where the main part of the algorithm here is going to go look for the reviewers.txt, the reviewers file, and look for the set of files modified and look up the users that are required for those files. And if they're marked as a user, then add them to the review request. If they're marked as a team, add them to the team request, because those are separate APIs in GitHub. And if they're an email address, then use the GitHub API to look up the email address and convert to a GitHub ID, and then add them as a normal user to the review request. So that's a pretty reasonable, algorithm there. I have a couple opens though, and that is about now our special files called code owners and reviewers. If those are modified, changing review ownership or code, maintainer ownership, what are the review requirements for that? Does that mean we have to notify both the old and the new owners for those files if we're modifying the review requirements? So I'm just curious what people's opinions are on that one for changing those specific metadata files.
How is code owners already handled? I assume that GitHub must add some protection to that file or only look at the version in your default branch or something like that. Is that true?
That's a good question. I actually need to go run those experiments, because the other thing I noticed, which is listed here, was even around the reviewers, is that the PR that you open may be against an older SHA in the history of, for example, the main branch, as far as where it was branched from. And so which version of the reviewers file do you want to use? Is it the one at the head of the target branch, or is it the one that's in the PR? Which would then allow a PR to then modify reviewers, and it would only use the reviewers from the one in the PR to do assignment, which seems like a way to potentially, bypass the review requirements, especially for the code owners file. So I do need to run that experiment, Sean, and I think reviewers should match the code owner's experience for that.
Okay.
What happens when somebody on their PR has been, the additional reviewers are needed and those reviewers are taken out of the reviewers list? What happens then?
Out of the target branch, head of the target branch?
Yeah.
So once reviewers are assigned to a PR when it was originally opened, I don't see changes to the reviewers until you do a forced push or a push to your PR, then it will reevaluate.
Okay, so I
So
mean,
if
if some reviewer leaves and that reviewer is no longer available, so you just basically would have to do a force push again?
To force it to reevaluate the reviewers, yes. What's interesting is there's actually, from the way GitHub does permissions, there's nothing that prevents, so far that I found, once a PR is opened and this initial set of code owners and reviewers are assigned, you can modify the reviewer list manually, meaning you can add more or even remove some, which is not great, but it does mean that you can add more that are, if there's a change to reviewers, you can manually resolve that issue.
Okay.
I guess looking at your test cases, I would add some test cases around where your PR contents change, and remove reviewers or add new areas of code that require new reviewers, or even force push a change that removes a whole patch set that would remove a set of required removers. And then to kind of mix that, you also have the chance that one of those reviewers may have already reviewed and submitted feedback. What do you do then?
Right, so I've actually already got this case covered that I just typed in, was if you add files that require new reviewers, then that works. One thing, I've got to look at the code owner's behavior. If I remove files that are modified from a PR, that remove existing reviewers, right? And at this moment, I'm saying this is a no-op on this last case. It's like once you're assigned to a PR, if there's a change to the PR contents for which you're no longer required, just leave you on the PR, right? And is the easy version of this that I've done, because I can't imagine very many cases where a PR is so significantly modified that that case occurs very often. Once again, I think we need to verify, check code owner's behavior for this. And we should match it. So if they actually do the remove, I know how to add the remove logic, but it's just extra, complexity that I don't know if we actually need or not.
Okay. And I guess if you leave them, then it does mean that if someone already added comments, you don't remove any of things, so it makes sense.
Right. Yeah, well, actually, the required reviewers would never remove any comments if you remove them from the assigned list. It just means that they're not part of the set that have been assigned. That's I think it's independent of comments. I think anybody can leave a comment.
Okay, great.
Some of the other things that are in here is that if you're working on a draft PR or convert a PR to a draft PR, then stop processing the reviewer's file, right? It's don't assign if it's open as a draft PR, and if you convert a PR to a draft PR, don't run the action that evaluates the reviewer's file until it becomes back to a normal PR. And as part of the action, I think we should minimize depth of Git fetches, minimize GitHub API calls. This is for performance. Minimize GitHub API calls is important because there are limits in GitHub Actions as far as how many API calls an hour per repo you're allowed to make, even with a valid GitHub token. So we just want to be cognizant of that and don't do extra API calls that aren't necessary. And we can also, since I'm using a bit of Python code, we can use the standard GitHub action for setting up a Python environment to do some pip caching, which can reduce some of your GitHub action execution time. And the code that I have for this already, that is doing everything that I list there in like 80 lines of code. With no extra external files at all. This is all within the single YAML GitHub action file. It sets up the pull request types for all the actions that are listed in that set of requirements for our two types of branches that we care about for monitoring. I've set it up in this sample repo with very restrictive permissions for GitHub Actions. You have to explicitly enable write permission for a subset of the types of actions that need it. So we never enable, for example, in this action, generic write access to the repo. It only has read-only access to the repo, and then only has now write access to like the pull request metadata, not the code itself, as an example. So it's a good way, just from a good management of permissions, to set it up that way. And this is the statement that takes care of if it's a draft, then skip it. Don't run the job. It runs on Ubuntu, checks out the PR, sets up the Python environment with a pip cache, with a pip requirements file for the small set of modules that we use for running this workflow. And then we actually run this Python script, which I put inline inside of the YAML file. So it has a code owners module, which knows the code owners format, and that's a standard pip module that's available, so we can read all of that in. We fetch the Git repo and basically determine the set of modified files by running the name only on the depth of the diffs that have depth of the commits that are associated with the PR. So that gets us the set of files. We then walk through that set of files and look up out of our code owner, our reviewers file here, to determine the set of reviewers, and we get a complete set of reviewers for all those files. And then we determine if they are listed in there as a username, a team, or an email. We add them to the appropriate user reviewers or team reviewers. If they're an email, this is the first time we have to actually make a GitHub API call to search for that email to see if there's a public email mapped to a GitHub ID. If there is, then we add that user login to the user reviewers. So that takes care of most of our cases. We then look at the set of already assigned reviewers and subtract away from the total reviewers needed to see if there's any that need to be added. So this set will be non-empty if there's additional reviewers that need to be added. This set will be non-empty if there's additional teams that need to be added. And then if and only if one of those two are non-empty, then we actually make the GitHub API call, passing in the new set of the reviewers, user reviewers and team reviewers to add. And that is the complete set of code that is functional now. And Mickey will tell you that she's gotten lots of notifications on this. But what this looks like for one that runs successfully in this assigned reviewers path. It took 12 seconds to run, so it runs pretty quick. And there. And the important part is the assigned reviewers, and it's got some good debug messages in here where it shows you each file that was modified and then what it found as the required reviewers for that file. In this case, the reviewers file is really simple. Mickey is the required reviewer for all files in this repository. So, and I put it in both as a username for a while and now as an email. And so because it's an email, it then has to make the API call to go look up that cross-reference and found out that it was this user ID. And that current pull request is here. And you can see that Mickey is assigned to it right now. So if I want to kind of go force this action to run again, I can convert this back to a draft, which means the action will ignore it for a minute here. I can take Mickey off of it manually. And you'll see at the bottom of this thread here that that I've removed Mickey, and then I can click ready for review. It'll run the action. Sorry for the mute there. So that's the complete sequence there as it ran through and assigned Mickey back to the PR. So most of this is
And I
functional.
can attest that I got a whole bunch more emails.
Yes.
Mike, do we really need anything more than team reviewers? Like, why would we not just have everyone be in a team?
Well, this is to map what we already have, and there's no reason to use teams. Other than that, there is a need to have like the EDK2 maintainers team for the maintainers. The other one that we're likely going to have to add is an EDK2 reviewers team or EDK2 collaborators team, because it is true that to have the reviewer role, where you can go in and say approved on the review and leave all the comments and things like that. You need to have write access to the PR to work with the metadata. And so you can't, so anybody that's outside of our approved set outside the organization cannot, open a review and do a review approved. So we are going to have a team such that everybody that's listed as a reviewer that's not a maintainer would be added to the reviewers team. And then from a permissions perspective, reviewers and maintainers would have triage access as a role such that they have right access to the PRs. As far
Okay.
as doing, like we had discussed earlier, the idea of did we need to do a team per package or per scope of review activity? I determined that is not necessary. That when you process code owners as individuals, just like we list them in maintainers.txt today, my understanding is that they are added to the PR and you do not require all of them to provide a yes vote. Only one of the code owners is required to provide a approval for it to meet the branch protection requirements. And the thing is, the same is true for our reviewers in that really I expect the reviewers, as many as want to, can review the PR and provide their comments or approvals, and that the maintainers who actually are monitored from the branch protection perspective will either do their own reviews or potentially trust a review from somebody else and then provide their approval based upon that review that was done by somebody else.
Okay, so you're saying functionally, if someone changes something in MD module package, for example, it will add all of the maintainers and reviewers for MDE module package to the PR. They just won't come from an MDE module package team. They'll come from the monolithic teams, but as the individuals that are associated with that package.
Correct.
Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and what's listed in code owners and reviewers are not team names, they are individuals. I've implemented support for teams if we ever find a use case where we need a team. But I think as far as how to map our existing maintainers.txt into this style, we don't have any need for the team feature right now.
And so, Mike, this is just for automatically added reviewers, right? Like if I want to CC somebody because they give good code review feedback, like for example, I CC Michael on things that he's not actually a maintainer on sometimes just because he gives good feedback, I can still do that somehow.
Yes, you can manually add reviewers. So what you'll see here is that when you click this on any of our PRs, anybody that's considered a collaborator, you can add them to the PR within the repo that you're working. So for example, for EDK2, anybody that's considered either a formal reviewer or a trusted, reviewer that's not necessarily formally part of our reviewers file, you could add them as a collaborator, and then they would be available to request for reviews of your content.
Okay.
But that's a manual process, yes. Kind of like if you were just CC somebody today as an additional CC item, this would be the mechanism you'd use in GitHub.
Okay.
Michael, I would also like to talk to you about this, about being used as a way for assigning code reviewers, or not code reviewers, but code owners to GitHub security advisories.
Yes, and I don't know what their mechanisms are for that, but yes, happy to talk to you about that. And if you also want to add this reviewers concept, obviously the way I've written this action, if it's not obvious, this is not repo specific at all. So this action right here is actually very generic and could be added to any repository if you wanted to have the concept of this reviewers file, and this action would add a set of reviewers to that PR.
Yeah, because the way that GitHub security reviews works is it actually creates a private fork of the current repository.
Right, and I don't know if they pay attention to the code owners file in that repo.
Okay.
Which is a little strange because then, yes, I know you have only a subset of developers that you want to have visibility to that issue.
Yes, and it stays private until, of course, we publish it. So.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I will set up some time to talk to you about that. I think we have a regular one-on-one, so I'll talk to you then.
So yeah, so kind of just to real quick, just to say that I think some of our opens here, and these are weird corner cases. I'll agree. What happens when the code owner's file is modified or the reviewer's filed? I think your advice, Sean, is great, which is to follow GitHub behavior for this, right? And the other one is this idea of the reviewers at the head of the target branch, and this one we want to check the code owner's behavior that as well. Or which version of the code owner's file do they use for the PR? Is it the head of the target branch, or is it the version of the code owner's file from the PR? And then we've got the other open here, which is around if we remove files from a PR across either an additional commit or a forced push, do we want to remove any reviewers? And once again, check the code owner's behavior for that. So I have some more experiments to run for those three categories of changes. But I just want to give an update that at least the idea of moving from maintainers to code owners and reviewers, syntactically, we can get the exact same result from the list of required code owners and required reviewers. And GitHub has the settings that I found for automatically assigning a code owner to the PR. And this one GitHub action provides at least the baseline of automatically adding reviewers with these few opens to address.
Sorry if I missed it. I know we've gone back and forth on several approaches over the last few weeks, but are you still requiring people to add their tags to the commit messages? Like the reviewed by and tested by stuff?
No, in this proposal that we're working on, we would not require that, so that the history of the PR as submitted for review, the commit message contents would require the signed off by going in, but that would be the only required tag on input. And there would be no requirement for the developer to add additional tags before the commit point, or for a automated agent to add tags at the commit point.
Okay. All right, great.
That's part of the write-up for the proposal. We obviously have to get that through the whole community, but that's what we're working on. And the reason for that is to minimize the number of automated actions that need to be implemented and supported in order to support this review process under GitHub.
Yeah, makes sense. And then whenever people force push, you said you're getting rid of you're resetting the review approvals, right?
Well, we're gonna have to look at the behavior of GitHub, and I think that's what Sean suggested last week. We have more experiments to do. I wanted to get this baseline of let's see if we can get the right set of people in to the review with the right roles, and then we can start looking at some more realistic test cases, maybe in the EDK2 code review repo with a changes with a identified set of reviewers that can help assess those, and we will document some use cases that we want to try out, like the forced push, and make sure that we look at the what changes across a forced push, and if we're okay with what that is. Does it reset everything or not? What's lost as far as the review comments or not?
Okay.
So, Mike, I guess one question to you though is what is kind of next in the roadmap for here to get PRs on the table as how we do reviews?
I think it really is that next one to go through those use cases of a real code review and make sure there's no unexpected behaviors that we have to deal with, right? Is everything that GitHub does by default, are we okay with all of those? With the idea of using a single PR and doing forced pushes for reformulation of the set of changes.
Okay.
I think that's the one that's the scenario that causes the most potential loss of information, right?
Yeah, for you're talking about force pushing kind of late in the process of the PR.
Yeah. Like
Yeah.
what we do today with the idea of our V1, V2, V3 of our series, using a forced push to go from one version to the next.
And where did we land on squash versus rebase and fast forward? Were you going to always squash or give flexibility there?
No flexibility. It's going to be, formulate the PR with the commits the way you want them to see in the history, and we'll just do the standard.
Okay.
Rebase, the fast forward rebase.
And then for the developer certificate of origin, that's covered by the existing PR gates we have today? Is that right?
No, it's actually handled today, I think, by patch check, because that's what looks for a valid signed off by in our commit message.
But patch check is running as a gate today.
Yes.
Yeah. So we don't need it. Like there are separate, I have found separate GitHub actions that will go off and check that. I didn't know if we were good leaving it as in patch check or if we wanted to have a explicit, hey, your commit wasn't didn't have the right signed off statement.
I would suggest, as far as how to get things going as fast as possible, let's just leave use of patch check in place for that. And if we find down the line that because we are using a simplified, version of the commit messages with fewer tags, maybe there's a way to go split that out. But patch check is doing a few other things for us beyond just the commit message. So that's what we have got to go figure out if it makes sense to just leave that as is or split it up in the future. But I wouldn't put that as a gating item for us to do the switch over to GitHub code reviews.
Yeah, sounds good. Anyone else on the call have any questions around this? I think this is a pretty big change that hopefully will improve reviews and visibility into the progress of a patch set.
And allow us to review stuff directly in VS Code, which is a significant step up from what we were doing with patch application before.
Yes, being able to do that in VS Code is huge.
Yeah, I can't wait. I actually already do it. Whenever I always look to see if someone has a PR up, because then I can just go into the GitHub VS Code plugin and easily pull down the branch and comment. So having this is just going to make it so much easier to track things and do that.
All right, I guess any other open topics?
I was wondering about Mike. It's not directly related to this. It kind of is. It is tools and CI kind of related, but Google Test, where you sent something related to Google Test a few weeks ago. Were you still planning to proceed with trying that, or where did you end up with your evaluation of that?
Yes, so yes, I did open a kind of a developer PR, PSC PR, just to make sure it passed all of the EDK2 CI. But that is something that I have evaluated, and using Google Test as a host-based test framework integrated into the EDK2 unit test framework does appear to work without any issues. The one feature that's remaining is how to do mocked interfaces with Google Test. It turns out that CMaka and Google Test are not compatible with each other. You can't build them together, so it means you can't use CMaka as your mocking framework with a Google Test framework. So the other thing that's available is Google Test has Gmock or Google Mock built into it, but it's focused on C++ code, not C code. I've seen some comments that it is possible to do some wrappers around the way you write the code for Gmock for C++ and get it to do mocking of a C interface, but it's fairly clumsy from a developer perspective. So that's where that stands right now. I think until we have a mocking interface, we can't provide Google Test as a alternative to the existing CMACA, because CMACA solution supports both a host-based unit test framework and mocking framework together.
Couple additional questions there. Like, did you on this pilot, did you kind of test out the scenarios where you want, like, for example, in our unit test framework stuff, we output the reports in XML format, which is whatever the Python unit PyTest format, which can be parsed, is all and collected and all that. Did all of that stuff work, or?
Yep. Yes.
Okay. And then did it fit into the unit test framework so that it, you can write code very similar to, or the same code almost as a shell test? Or is that kind of a work item that we didn't try to align with?
Yeah, Google Test as it's a host environment only. So the only thing you can do is the application that runs inside of a CI agent.
Do you remember on the CMACA, you could have test code that basically ran in both the shell environment and your local host environment. And the only difference, I believe, was the entry point. That is not the case in this scenario. Is that just so I understand? Okay.
Yeah, I because of the Google Test is implemented in C++ and has a dependency on structured exception handling, which we don't have in our UEFI environment, application environment. So that's a gap there. So I don't believe that, I haven't even tried it. I don't believe it will work. And there may be some significant development activities in order to even consider that.
Okay. And is this, I mean, I guess I am curious. There's two thoughts I have. Number one is, unfortunately, we haven't seen the community start using host-based testing and contributing those tests, at least. Do you think this will help address that, or do you think this will introduce more test framework without anyone writing tests?
Yeah, well, actually, the reason I even did the pilot is that we had some really good feedback that the developer experience writing tests under Google Test is much simpler and fewer lines of code to write a test. In addition, there's a number of UIs or helper tools around Google Test that give you better visibility to your tests and the ability to go run one test at a time or a subset of tests from a framework. In fact, there's a Visual Studio Code plugin that supports Google Test directly, and you can browse directly to your test code, run tests individually, run tests as suites, or run tests as a complete set together as a development environment. So that, and if you then fold in also some things like code coverage, I think that you would have a much easier development environment than what we have with the current unit test framework.
On that subject, Sean, have you taken or had a chance to take a look at the XUnit dispatcher example I gave?
No, all I've seen was the emails. I didn't actually look at any code.
Okay.
I mean, I like the idea as a whole, don't get me wrong at all, right? Having to write less connecting and boilerplate code is great. So I'm supportive. I just was curious.
Well, the Google Test stuff that you sent, I thought was pretty nice. It was simple and plugged in really easily.
Yeah, and that I can put the link in the minutes if you want, Sean, or in the chat, so you can put it in the minutes. I even ported the safe-intlib to the Google Test style, so you can compare and contrast the source code to the unit tests themselves.
And so do you kick this thing off in the same way you're using the EDK2 build system, or are we trying to use a native build system?
I just use the same Well, it's interesting. I think that there's two ways to do it. I think some of the plugins like Visual Studio Code or these tools that layer on top, they may be, I forget how they invoke the build. Oh no, you point at the executable. So no, you're using the EDK2 build system to build the application, and then you point them at the exe, and then they'll go parse it out and figure out how many test cases there are, and allow you to browse those and run individual ones from the exe. And so we're using our native EDK2 build system to build them, which also means that we're using PyTools to build from a CI agent perspective, or even locally to build and run the tests automatically.
Okay.
And the
Nice.
and the VS Code plugin like auto discovers the executables as far as I could tell. Unless you had configured something, but I didn't configure anything. It just found the executable, detected the test in it, and then it automatically displayed the pass and fail results for the test. And it lets you run individual tests directly in the VS Code UI. So you can, it to me was a lot more intuitive, and you got faster turnaround on being able to change the code and see the test result, which is like the big advantage that I liked to it was having that instant feedback in the editor of what you're changing and seeing the results.
So what's, I guess, the next step here? Like, I mean, to be honest, all this sounds great.
As I said, the mocking feature is the one that I have to find a solution to, Sean. So that's what I'm doing, some additional evaluation of. If others, I posted the link there. If others have ideas on either how to use Gmock with C code more effectively, or other mocking interfaces that you think would be acceptable for EDK2, that would be that are compatible with GTest, that would be a good direction there.
So is that the only blocker to getting it in, or do you consider that not to be a blocker?
I consider it to be a blocker because if you look at even the small set of existing test cases we have in the EDK2, like the one around the runtime services, uses a mocked interface for the reset library to get to mock the runtime service reset system. And so I think if we want to have this as an alternative to CMOCA, we want to show that it can be used for host-based testing and mocking of interfaces within host-based testing, because you won't get very far with unit testing if the only thing you can test are APIs of type base with no dependencies on any other services.
I mean, I was thinking along the same lines as Michael there, which is, it seems like we could enable this without mocking support, and mocking could be discovered or figured out later. I agree with you. There is lots of code that won't work, but there is code that will work. And one of the pieces of feedback my team has had around this host-based unit test stuff is that once they write one, even if it's pretty trivial, it gives them a whole new perspective on how they should be writing the rest of their firmware code so that it's easier to run tests on. And to me, that's really the thing that we're missing in the community right now, is that we need more people to write a few of these so that they think differently when they write their code. And ideally, they isolate most of their dependencies into, initialized functions and some basic functions, and then all of the complicated logic, business logic, can be running in code that can be easily host-based tested.
I agree completely that it encourages the design for test if you know you have to write tests.
Yeah.
And it really didn't look like that much overhead was being introduced to support it based on your branch.
Oh, right. Yeah, it was pretty easy to integrate. There's a lot of magic in a few of the lines to get all the flags right. But yes, it was not too bad to get it added.
And I guess, sorry, last question. Is the code coverage, is it part of the tool? Or is it something that we still have to enable using external tools and compiler flags and additions?
Yeah, that's still an external thing, like use gcub on the Linux builds, and I think I've got a tool that I think we've had some success with for Visual Studio as well.
Okay, I'd love to see that. We've talked with our Visual Studio team and it hasn't gone well. So
yeah, I don't think
I'd
this
love
is
to
the one built into Visual Studio. I think this is an external tool.
yeah, no, I can believe that. I don't think the one built into Visual Studio is the right path. So I'm curious what's available out there for Visual Studio. Yeah.
Do they have like an MS test thing for C++ yet, or?
They do.
Okay.
They have a couple, and I think they're pretty cool. I think they do some neat things, but they're really heavily integrated into Visual Studio.
Yeah, that's what I remember.
Yeah.
But last time I checked, it was C# only, but that was a really long time ago.
They have support for some pretty standard stuff. Like now, the Uncrustify code, if you go look at that, it actually runs Uncrustify against itself, and it has like over 1,000 tests that run, and those all get picked up automatically in Visual Studio. And it's in C++, and it's a pretty decent experience. You can have test runners, and it splits things up by groups, and you can run individual tests and all that kind of stuff. I forgot what framework it's using, but it plugged in pretty easily with that.
Okay, well, it sounds like, I guess, again, my feedback would be, I'd love to see it contributed sooner rather than later, and I don't view the lack of mocking as a blocker to get it into the code base. But I'll leave that to you guys.
Okay. Well, I'm definitely willing to. I haven't put it out for a full community review yet because I wanted to get this like initial level of feedback from the unit test framework package maintainers, which is why Michael Tubaki was copied on it. But I'll definitely open it up, the existing one, for the full community review to get feedback. And if nobody has any objections about adding that without mocking support, that's great. We can do that.
I just worry if we do, then people are going to start trying to write things and they won't have mocks, and then they'll say this sucks, and then they'll give up and never come back to it.
The first thing you said, where people start to write tests, that got me excited. I didn't think people would do that.
Well, I mean, you know, if you try something and your experience is crap, then you're probably not going to do it again. You know, that's the thing I worry about.
Yeah.
Well, you have to kind of roll up your sleeves and do a little bit of work, but it wasn't a crappy experience that I had. I don't mind writing a function that returns EFI success and invalid parameter and set a buffer to a value.
Yeah, I don't mind it either, but I'm thinking of people far lazier than you and I.
I think we might be able to maybe write some standardized mocks ourselves as well if we find those useful. I know at least me and a couple other people have all stubbed out the boot services, I think, and some other tables that are pretty standard.
Right, and
Yeah.
within the unit test framework package itself, we have a number of libraries that are host compatible that we've done to map some of our commonly used APIs that we don't want to mock. We just want to have something get called and do something appropriate within the host application environment. So I think what you're describing, Michael, is we could extend that set of libraries, you know, if needed, including there's one of, like, for example, the base lib. And the base lib, especially for x86, has some APIs that the actual implementation would cause an exception or a fault because it's a privileged instruction that's only executable in ring 0. And so running it as an application mode, it does that. So there's actually a special version of baselib with the ability to hook those interesting functions if you need to mock them or have a different behavior for them within your application, your test code, I mean. So we have some techniques where we've done exactly that, like the boot services, you could have a generic, version that at least provides it, and then you can then choose to hook different ones if you want to provide some behavior.
Yeah, I put a link to one of my examples. I think I've done boot services a few times. That one's in Tiano Core.
Boot services is nice. I also, I don't know if you guys have seen this one. I made a mock version of IOLib that actually like emulates CF8 and CFC and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think we're ready for Google Test then. We can just start plugging it into all these things.
Yeah, it's a good perspective. I mean, figuring out how to use mocks is probably something that a lot of people won't do anyway. Or I guess I should say CMOCA style auto-generated mocks. But
Alright.
I do need to get that that IOLib checked in at some point. Been on my list for a couple years.
Are there other things people want to bring up?
Completely unrelated, but I think we're pretty close to getting the Alder Lake MIM platform support open sourced.
Does it still have the platform init advanced module?
There has been no architectural improvements on the client side.
Okay.
On the server side, we're making progress.
Alright, any other open source topics for today?
I guess just one going back to the PR thing, is there, so in general, EDK2 platforms has lagged behind or in many cases never caught up to EDK2 in terms of like CI and capabilities like that. Are we going to try to move EDK2 platforms to the PR model like around the same time as EDK2? Okay. And that means it will pick up PR gates and CI at that point kind of inherently as well.
Right, if they're enabled. Yeah, so yeah, my goal is once we decide that we can do this PR-based code review, all of the repos that are currently using email-based ones, we should figure out a fast transition plan to get them all over. Because the worst scenario we can be in is different repos have different processes, right? That's just horribly confusing for the community. So we do need to figure out that once we are confident in it, let's just propagate it. And a lot of the other repos are actually lower frequency than the EDK2 repo as far as the EDK2 platforms may be a tie, but the other repos, all the document repos and EDK2 libc and the non-OSI, those repos are a little lower frequency. So I think they'll even be easier to enable. The single biggest task is actually porting maintainers.txt to that code owners and maintainers format, that for which EDK2 is the most complicated. The rest of them are much simpler maintainers files.
Okay. Yeah, I'm assuming that whenever we do it, we'll probably focus more on the review process than enabling like the CI and PI, the CI tools and like the PR gates surrounding it, like maybe patch check and things like that. But it seems like a good opportunity to try to bring a lot of those packages up to speed with like the processes being used in EDK2 as well.
Right. I mean, you could add all the YAML files for the packages, and they could have all their tests at warning only just to get them things started. Then we can then incrementally fix them.
Yep.
And also, did we get any discussion going on the list about Richard Hughes and Martin Fernandez's presentation last week at the Tiana Core community meeting about actually adding SBOM? There is a patch up there on the site, and I would really like to see some discussion on this. And if you want to see, the community meeting was recorded, so it's up on the YouTube channel.
I still need to watch the video myself. I was planning to, but didn't get to it yet.
And then we're going to change Michael Kinney's name to Michael D. Spammer.
Debugging GitHub Actions or any of the cloud services is a challenge.
Yes, it is. I recognize that from the get-go.
Question on the
Actually-
SBOM. LVFS obviously is driving this because they have a plan for how they want to use the data. Is there any other community members that have been, driving SBOM conversations?
I know we've been discussing it because one of the big problems we have is with security tools, not being able to identify anything inside of inside of any of our images.
So there's been a couple Intel solutions that have been pushed out. Are those things that we would get rid of and start using this SBOM information?
But would be nice to have the SBOM information as a way for all those, all of the communities in general that are using EDK2 to be doing it the same way instead of everybody doing it one-offs.
I agree. I just think there's gonna need to be someone who pushes pretty hard, and I guess I was trying to understand if there was a coalition yet of people pushing.
I don't think there is, but I really do like their idea. I know you were there, Michael, weren't you? At that presentation?
Yes.
And what was your impression?
It's a good start. It's like anything. It's all
Yeah.
engineering exercises are a good compromise. It's very simple what the initial patch is. It's not a complete solution. It's only to get it into the PE Coff image scope. The rest of the tooling to, for example, elevate it to a full firmware image scope and easily discoverable is not there. So I think their initial patch is really, and the conversation is just to get something started and keep it simple. And then let it kind of grow organically from that point forward to actually meet product needs.
Okay, sounds good. My plan is to, after watching it, hopefully try to engage our Windows Update team and see if they're willing to speak publicly about any of it, or if they have any plans or usage around it, because I think that is the natural other big user of this data.
Yeah, and it's like Michael said, this is not a complete solution by any means. And there were lots of questions around how we do other things, but at least it's a start.
This might be a good thing to like try to bring into an EDK2 platform as well to kind of demonstrate like a platform integration of the SBOM information.
Agreed. I just want it because it makes my job easier.
Is there a technical spec that they put out or a reference that they put out that we can look at? And what I'm looking for is things around how does this coincide with Authenticode? As far as is the SBOM section authenticated? There's some other use cases that we've looked at resource sections for in the past around what some have called secure boot advanced targeting or secure boot vNext. But this is around, and it has very similar desires, at least for some of the data. So I guess I was curious, is there a spec out there that they made available?
Not per se. They did put the patch up and it's available up on the up on the groups IO. And I don't believe that there's been any talk about, how we make this, secure or anything in that nature. That was left open. This was just merely a way of getting in some SBOM information so that it was easily discoverable. And in a way that actually makes sense for the way that EDK2 platforms are built.
I think we'll learn this whenever we watch the video, but is it based
Yeah.
on a existing standard or anything like that? Or is it something that they came up with?
Wasn't this based on an existing standard, Michael, if I remember correctly?
No, it's just free format text. Remember, they said they just were trying to figure out what to capture as some initial information, but it's not. I don't think there's a standard. 'Cause I asked that question of, did they borrow from SBOM from like full application kind of space and things like that, and they said no.
Okay, I was assuming there would be like maybe a NIST standard or something out there around this already, but I haven't done a lot of research on the topic yet.
I haven't either. I haven't had a lot of free time.
Yeah, I'd encourage to take the conversation back directly to the patch submitter so we can get these
Yeah.
questions answered for the whole community to see, and we can, if we have requirements that are different than what they've been, let's make sure that they know what they are.
Yeah, that's why I say I want to just get a conversation started here on this.
Okay, any last opens? With that, we
So-
can be, go
Oh.
ahead.
Sorry. Do you know if there's any relation between this SBOM stuff and the SBOM stuff that AMI has been talking about? Because I'm kind of wondering if they're just kind of off doing their own thing or not.
I do not know.
Well, I know that there's been like a wider emphasis on SBOM across the industry in general recently, but who knows what formats and standards people are following.
Exactly.
But I think given that it's a requirement for procurement coming, I think late this year, I think everyone is scrambling to find a solution. So I would guess that all major players in the industry are doing something. Highly doubtful that any of it's aligned.
I doubt it too, and that's why I would like to actually have something that was actually built into EDK that is, a starting point for anyone that uses it. That they can add to it as they see fit, but at least that we have a minimal SBOM that is available.
Kevin, I'm guessing you guys have been approached for something like this. Is that accurate or anything you're willing to share? Okay. Well, if I find out anything from anyone who's willing to share, I'll let you know, Nate, from what I hear.
Well, so
Sorry,
here's the
e-
the public slides that AMI presented that at least I'm aware of. So, and they did
do know
mention.
that-
Oh.
I do know that AMI and Richard worked kind of closely. I don't know exactly what that means. And Richard has talked to us. It's not completed enough of a solution for us to accept it whole cloth. It's mainly interested in licensing and not in the enough version information. It's rather large, but then again, I don't see how you could get, the kind of information you need. I don't see how you can get it in a really small place, small size. He's saying 29K, I believe was his number, and that takes up a whole nother page, almost half a page at least. And, that's without any customization and very little versioning information. So those are the kind of things that Tim Lewis said back to me when I was talking to him about it.
Okay.
If you'd like for me to get Tim involved in a discussion with Richard on the phone so everybody can hear, I'm more than happy to help set something like that up with Richard and whoever else wants to get involved.
Yeah, I would like to be involved.
Yeah.
So I pasted in chat the slides from AMI's presentation from a couple months ago. They did mention that they were doing some implementation, at least for Aptio. I don't know exactly what it looks like though.
Okay.
Are these open slides? This is what they presented at the UEFI Plug Fest.
It's open
Bright Talk.
slides. It was from the OCP talk, but
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tim was there.
okay.
Okay, sounds good. I mean, I think from my view, I think we definitely have to have a driver of this, right? Like you said, Kevin, there's a lot of information that could be added to this, but someone has to make it valuable and interesting. And I view that kind of as either LVFS or Windows Update or someone else who's a centralized authority that would be checking versions. And I don't know who that is. Otherwise, we can build all the crap we want, but it's going to meet the government requirement, but it's not going to move anybody forward.
Right.
So I will, from the Microsoft side, I will try to reach out to Windows Update and see if anyone is doing anything regarding this.
If they are, let me know, Sean, because I would like to have them come to the community.
Okay.
We could also tell the government they're going to have to write like 20 different applications to be able to parse and interpret all of the software bomb information unless they standardize something that we can use. And that might drive us down a straightforward and single path.
No, that doesn't sound like the government.
Yeah, how do you get your lucrative contracts if it's not hard?
Exactly.
Yes, you provide the parser with your firmware code.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We will talk next week.
Thanks, Sean.
Bye.
Thank you.